Hello and welcome to the program. My name is Tamara Rosevan. Back in 2015, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko suggested that a UN peacekeeping force would help bring about an end to Russia's hybrid war in eastern Ukraine. This idea was supported by the NATO former chief Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Now, he said that a 20,000 strong UN peacekeeping force would actually bring lasting ceasefire. Now, can an international mission be an effective way to stop the Kremlin's ambitions in Donbass? We're joined by Stephen Pifer. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So, just to start things off, the UN peacekeeping force, this was also spoken about, and Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko mentioned this during his speech at the Kyiv Security Forum, and it seems that this is something that's being supported by Ukraine's partners as well. Now, what would a successful UN peacekeeping mandate look like?
Well, I think the first question is, do the Russians want peace in Donbass? Up until now, Moscow appears to use that simmering conflict in Donbass as a mechanism to put pressure on the government of Kyiv to try to keep Ukraine from being successful. So the question is, are the Russians prepared to find a way out of Donbass? If the answer is yes, then I think a UN peacekeeping force could be part of the answer. Now, for that force to be successful, it has to be properly manned. I think 20,000 troops would be a minimum. It has to have a robust mandate. It has to be able to deal with actively if there's resistance. And it's going to have, you might have that force come in phases, but you don't want to have the force get stuck on the line of contact, because then you just take a simmering conflict and make it a frozen conflict. That's not progress. You want to have a phasing that is almost automatic, so that force quickly operates throughout all of Donbass, including on the Ukraine-Russian border. That would be a successful mandate, I believe.
Now, so you think there should be a line of peacekeepers along the Ukraine-Russia border? That's key, in your opinion?
Yeah, within a very quick period of time, that force should be able to operate through all of occupied Donbass.
Now, during the Kyiv Security Forum, also Ukraine's President Petro Poroshenko said that we're in the midst of the new Cold War that has hybrid elements. Now, and it's actually affecting the lives of millions of people. Would you agree with this?
Yeah, I tend not to use the term Cold War just because I think the Cold War that we had for 4 decades between the United States and the Soviet Union was very different in many ways. But certainly you have a Russia that is prepared to go beyond internationally accepted rules. You know this very well in Ukraine. Russia's use of force to seize and illegally annex Crimea, the Russian involvement in Donbass. We've seen it in terms in the United States of Russians' interference in our election. So there is a level of conflict here that's going on. And I believe we have to find a way to basically push back against this. We have to make clear to Moscow that this kind of behavior is not acceptable. And the question will then be, will then Russia adjust its behavior? If so, then you may be able to get back to a better relationship between the West and Russia, and it also may increase the prospects for peace in Ukraine.
And if you think about it, Russia has been using hybrid tactics for almost a decade. If we look back to 2007, when Russian hackers launched a cyber attack on Estonian parliament, government offices, ministries.
We saw, I mean, it goes back long before that. We used to call these Soviet active measures. During the Cold War, you saw things that were designed to divide Western societies, to split the United States from Europe, for example. What the Russians are just doing now is discovering with cyber their new techniques, with social media their new techniques. You know, but it's the same sort of idea. They're just using sort of the modern techniques that have evolved in the last 15 to 20 years.
So do you think there's going to be an escalation?
Again, I think we have to find a way to push back on this. So, for example, I would assume that in Western intelligence agencies, there's considerable information about the corruption close to the Kremlin, about oligarchs who have very wealthy because of their connections to Mr. Putin. Maybe it's time for the West to begin putting that information out. Because I think that would have some resonance with the Russian population, which may support Mr. Putin but doesn't like corruption. And that maybe we can establish a degree of deterrence. The message should be is, if you're going to do this, interfere in our elections, try to divide us, we can do things that will make you and the Kremlin uncomfortable.
I think that's something that the Russian opposition is trying to do. They're putting out these videos. Navalny, I believe he's making these videos, and it has resonance in the population because people are coming out. Thousands of people came out over the past couple of months.
But maybe the West ought to be trying to do that, some of that of its own too, to signal the Russians that if you're going to use social media to try to sow dissension in our societies, we can do the same back to you. And the message with Russia is, if you don't do it, we won't do it.
Right. Yeah. Coming back to Ukraine, is there a difference between U.S. rhetoric? We're constantly hearing this. People are very gravely concerned. They're very conserved, and we have these addresses by the U.S. State Department spokesperson Heather Nauert, where she has condemned Russia numerous times, and she uses very, very powerful language. I think she's very, very, very clear. But is there a difference between the U.S. rhetoric and its actions? Even when we look at Ukraine, we look at Syria. We've seen some things that U.S. officials have said in order to get Russia to pull back a little bit, what effect that's had. And so is there a difference between talk and actual action?
Well, I think you have seen the Trump administration move to back its rhetoric with action. So you saw the sanctions a week ago that were announced that had a pretty significant impact on certain Russian entities and certain Russian oligarchs. You saw the expulsion by the United States of 60 Russian diplomats as part of this global effort to signal the Russians that their behavior in Salisbury with the assassination attempt was unacceptable. So I think you have seen action, and I guess I'd describe it, action that is moving in a direction that maybe we didn't expect 15 months ago. I sense that here in Ukraine, there was some concern when Mr. Trump was elected president, because some of the things he'd said on the campaign trail. What I would argue is you've actually seen pretty much a continuation of the Obama administration's policy in the last year towards Russia and Ukraine, including with some toughening. For example, the decision that President Obama would not make, which President Trump did make, to provide lethal military assistance to Ukraine. So I think that you are seeing some backing to that rhetoric. I think there should be more steps, but there is in fact actions that support the words.
The U.S. sanctions on that you just mentioned on Russian individuals, oligarchs who have connections to the Kremlin, like Oleg Deripaska. We know that his company's shares have fallen dramatically, and they called it Black Monday, among other Russian oligarchs. But and the Ukrainian president, after a few days, announced, also at the Kyiv Security Forum, he said that there's been some efforts made to create a Ukrainian sanctions list, which would include Oleg Deripaska, and some steps have already been taken. And in your opinion, what kind of impression does this have on Ukraine's Western allies, who see that Ukraine is following suit after U.S. takes these steps? But should Ukraine have announced these sanctions earlier? Should Ukraine have sanctioned these Kremlin-linked individuals earlier?
Well, I'm not sure about on the timing, but it certainly seems, again, it's a step of unity with the West if Ukraine is applying some of the same types of sanctions that the United States and Europe apply. So I think that's a good signal. And again, it sends a signal of solidarity between Ukraine, Europe, and the United States that I think has some impact on Moscow. My guess is that, for example, the Russians would not have predicted 4 years ago, in 2014, that in 2018 the European Union would still have fairly severe economic sanctions on Russia and have in fact taken steps to strengthen those sanctions. So that kind of unity, I think, surprises the Kremlin, and hopefully it leads the Kremlin to conclude that they need to find a different path.
I see. And last question, do you think that the U.S. should be more involved in the Minsk negotiations? For example, when there's a meeting of the Normandy format, when leaders, the German Chancellor, the French President, Ukrainian President, and the Russian President, when they meet to discuss the conflict in Ukraine, do you think the U.S. should be at the table?
That's an interesting question, and I guess my answer would be, I'm not sure. If it was clear that U.S. presence at the table would lead to some kind of a breakthrough, I'd be all for it. I'm not sure, though, that you can say that at this point. And the one risk of bringing the United States to the table is with a very difficult relationship between Washington and Moscow. Do you bring that competitive U.S.-Russian dynamic into the Minsk process in a way that might be unhelpful. So I'm actually fairly comfortable with where the United States is going now, which is working to support the Normandy format. The conversations, for example, that have been taking place, between Ambassador Volker and Mr. Surkov. Ambassador Volker is here regularly. He consults here in Ukraine. He consults in Germany and France to make sure that what the U.S. is doing with Russia is very much in sync and does not go in a different direction. And at least for the moment, that may be the right way to proceed. If it becomes apparent down the road that an American presence at the table would lead to some kind of breakthrough, then I think that would make sense.
I see. Very, very interesting point. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So we've been joined by Mr. Stephen Pifer. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and also a fellow at the Brookings Institute. You're watching UATV.